Welcome to episode 227 of the Selling Your Screenplay podcast. I'm Ashley Scott Myers, screenwriter and blogger over at sellingyourscreenplay.com. Today I'm interviewing writer-director Fritz Bohm. He just did a fantasy thriller film called Wildling, starring Liv Tyler. We talk about that film, how it all came together, and we also talk about the early days of his career and kind of how he got his start in the business. So stay tuned for that interview. Towards the end of the podcast, I'm going to talk about option agreements. I get questions about option agreements all the time, and I thought I would lay out some of my thoughts on them. So stay tuned for that. I wanted to give a quick shout out to Script Society. They're running a mentorship program that I wanted to tell you about. Script Society's online screenwriting mentorship program is an 8-week course that will take you from idea conception to a completed first draft. This program is unique in that you will receive detailed feedback on your work every week. The purpose here is to provide realistic deadlines that will keep you on track and suggestions to improve your work. You can learn more about this at scriptsociety.com. The next session begins June 4th, 2018 and will be filling up fast. If you use coupon code MENTOR101, you'll get a discount when you check out. So don't forget to use that coupon code. I will link to all of this in the show notes, so don't worry about writing this down now. Just find episode 227 of the podcast. If you want to learn more about this, you can go to sellingyourscreenplay.com/podcast and then just look for episode number 227. And again, I will link out to Script Society and I will put the coupon code there as well. If you find this episode valuable, please help me out by giving me a review in iTunes or leaving a comment on YouTube or retweeting the podcast on Twitter or liking or sharing it on Facebook. These social media shares really do help spread word about the podcast, so they're very much appreciated. Any websites or links that I mention in the podcast can be found on my blog in the show notes. I also publish a transcript with every episode in case you'd rather read the show or look at something later on. You can find all the podcast show notes at www.sellingyourscreenplay.com/podcasts and then just look for episode number 227. If you want my free guide, How to Sell a Screenplay in 5 Weeks, you can pick that up by going to sellingyourscreenplay.com/guide. It's completely free. You just put in your email address and I'll send you a new lesson once per week for 5 weeks along with a bunch of bonus lessons. I teach the whole process of how to sell your screenplay in that guide. I'll teach you how to write a professional logline and query letter and how to find agents, managers, and producers who are looking for material. Really is everything you need to know to sell your screenplay. Just go to sellingyourscreenplay.com/guide. So a quick few words about what I'm working on. A quick update on The Pinch, the crime thriller feature film that I wrote, directed, and produced last year. I'm still working on the poster. I think my original poster artist wasn't quite up to the task. He created a first version, which I wasn't crazy about, and as we started to go back and get notes, just his responses got less and less frequent, and I think it's time for me to basically move on and start over with a new artist. I have been slowly trying to finalize my plans for distribution. Right now, my plan is to release the film first through the podcast right here. It'll probably be in the next few weeks, so just keep an eye out for that announcement. And then I'll be rolling out the film once I've kind of released it here through Selling Your Screenplay. Then I'll be rolling it out to the typical platforms, iTunes, Amazon, all of those various platforms. So again, stay tuned for that announcement. In terms of my new, what I'm working on in terms of writing, I'm just about finished with the show Bible for an animated kids TV show I'm working on. I'm going to get notes tomorrow on that show Bible in my writers group, and then I will be writing the pilot episode over the next few weeks. So writing wise, that's what I'm working on. I've also been doing some producer type stuff over the last couple weeks. The kids TV show that I wrote last winter, and I've talked about that a couple of times on the podcast, I'd say that's kind of hit some speed bumps. One of the producers is sort of stepping away from the project. So I met with the main actor / producer last week just to see if he might be potentially interested in me coming on as a producer. He seems open to that idea, so we're discussing that, and maybe I can kind of keep the project moving forward. This is a project I like a lot, so anything I can do to keep it moving forward, I'm happy to do. So as with most things in the business, it's really just a matter of raising the money. And the current producer, the actor producer, he's got some leads on this. Obviously, I can potentially bring in some money and bring some leads on this. But it's just a matter of, pushing the project forward. I do think it's a great project, and hopefully we can keep things going. So we'll see how that works out. Anyways, that's what I'm working on. Now let's get into the main segment. Today I am interviewing writer-director Fritz Bohm. Here is the interview. Welcome, Fritz, to the Selling Your Screenplay podcast. I really appreciate you coming on the show with me today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So to start out, maybe you can tell us a little bit about your background. Where did you grow up, and how did you get interested in the entertainment business?
I originally grew up in Germany, but only the first 3 years. Then my family moved to New Jersey, and then we eventually came back to Germany in the 90s, early 90s. So I basically grew up soaking in all kinds of 80s movies and TV shows like a sponge. And then, in my teen years, it became clear that I wanted to be a filmmaker. So I started doing short films, and later visited a film school in Munich in Germany, and during that time founded a production company where I started out as a producer in the German entertainment industry. I also did a lot of post-production supervision, basically to keep my production company afloat together with my partner Sven Nuri. And then at some point it just became inevitable that with my love for, fantasy-driven films and fairy tale-esque stories, that I would need to, go back to the U.S. and see if I could make it there in the entertainment world. So, at some point I did that, and then Wildling is the first result of that decision, basically.
Okay, perfect.
And so it took me about 4 or 5 years. Yeah.
Okay, and I noticed on IMDb you've done an enormous number of shorts, and I wonder if you can just speak to those, how those might have helped you, in your career.
Well, everything is learning by doing. I think it's the best thing to just gather as much practical experience as possible. You're never going to learn how to be a filmmaker by sitting in some classroom. It might help, you might make contacts that could be helpful later on, stuff like that. But generally my attitude was always, who cares what capacity I'm working in, whether I'm the driver or the PA or the post-production guy. I just want to make films and be part of the process and learn. Mm-hmm. And, once I had established myself with post-production supervision, it was really great because I got to work with so many different directors and editors and composers, visual effects people, sound editors, so that all of that was learning, to the point where I felt like, okay, now I know how to do this kind of movie that I want to do. I know it now, mm-hmm. Like I can dare to make that step.
Yeah. So let's dig into Wildling, starring Liv Tyler. That's your new film that's coming out. Maybe to start out, you can just give us a quick pitch or log line. What is that film all about?
Wildling is, first of all, it's going to come out on April 13th on video on demand and in select theaters starting in New York and LA.
Perfect.
And it's going to be about a little girl named Anna who becomes a woman. So pretty much like what we all go through when we go through puberty, except in her case, it goes a little further than that. And there is also a monster in the movie. So it's kind of it's a dark fairy tale, and it's an indie film that will take you to some strange places that you hopefully haven't seen like that before.
Uh-huh. And where did this idea come from? What was the sort of the kernel of idea that this came from?
The real kernel, to be honest, was my mother reading me fairy tales almost every night as a kid. And me as a kid just being attracted to these strange mythological creatures, whether they're characters in a fairy tale like Rumpelstiltskin or the Big Bad Wolf, or, you know, or characters in a picture book. You know, I was always a sucker for these creatures, and at some point I just had the wish to create my own misunderstood creature. And it became the Wildling. It was a process. It was, you know, there was an evolution to the idea. Two of my best friends helped me along the way, and we talked out everything over hours and hours and hours of Skype sessions, and then, you know, eventually landed on this story, which is exactly that. It's a dark fairy tale, and it's about a misunderstood creature.
Perfect. Where did let's talk about your writing process a little bit. How much time did you spend? It sounds like it was pretty extensive, having conversations with friends, getting feedback and stuff. But maybe we can break that down into, you know, before you open Final Draft. How much time did you spend outlining the script versus how much time did you spend actually in Final Draft writing scenes and dialogue and stuff?
Yeah, I spent quite some time, and, you know, maybe I wasn't the most efficient in that process. I don't know. I certainly spent 3 or 4 years just having that idea percolate, and then, you know, having it linger there and trying out different angles, and like, you know, sometimes during the process I got too excited and dove right into writing a draft, but then at some point, you know, quickly trash that draft again because I realized something isn't adding up, or it doesn't feel quite right. And the idea just needed to ripen a little longer. But honestly, the moment the character was clear, the moment it was clear it's about puberty and it's about Anna's journey, and we're telling a story that basically is a journey from captivity to freedom, with everything that comes with it in terms of an exaggerated puberty and this fantasy premise that there is such a thing as Wildling. The moment those things were clear, we wrote the treatment in 8 days, Florian and I, and then we wrote the script in another 8 days. And that script was pretty much it, like little to no changes happened until we were shooting, you know?
Yeah. I'm curious, just want to dig into something you said. You had started some of these drafts and it didn't feel right, so you would scrap them and go over. How do you do that balancing act? Because oftentimes, I think as writers, we never quite feel like it's going as well as we had expected. And there's always this balancing act between, you know, making something good versus being too much of a perfectionist. How do you sort of navigate that?
Well, you can really get caught up in the nitty-gritty of a scene and in the staging of it and, you know, the visuals that come to mind, and you start falling in love with certain ideas, and then it gets really hard to separate from them again if something doesn't work on a larger level in your script. So what I learned from the process is that character is first. It has to come first. You have to be really sure what your character is, because that will save you so much you know, effort if you know who your character is, because that's your ultimate guide in judging whether something is right or whether something is a little off. So, you know, I don't know if we succeeded with that mission, but that was our mission, and it was definitely, you know, once the character was clear, things started falling into place. And, you know, I'm not saying that all the drafts that were earlier were useless. Certainly not, because you also develop kind of a trove of ideas. And, you know, even if they end up on the boneyard, it's great to have them, you know, because you might need them later on, then you can pull them out of your hat and say, well, I already wrote that version 2 years ago. Here it is, or something like that. But
yeah,
I think for me, it was a learning experience to be able to be very critical towards my own work and being able to say, well, if I'm not nailing the character, then I have to be ready to trash everything I've done and do a page one rewrite.
yeah.
I have to be able to separate from something. Yeah.
So let's talk about now. You have a script written. What were your next steps to actually getting it produced? Did you have some contacts that you could take it to? What were those steps to actually taking the raw script to a produced film, raising money, all of that?
It was actually pretty straightforward. Like when I still had the production company in Germany, Sven, my partner, and I produced a teaser for this idea. Mm-hmm. It was like a 1-minute mini trailer that had some themes of the idea, but the script wasn't ready yet. It wasn't even really written yet. So it was more of a collection of ideas, and on basis of that, I produced this trailer. But that trailer did get me some attention, along with the short that I had made, and I found a fantastic manager through some recommendations, and that manager, Lee Stobie, then said, okay, well, this trailer looks awesome, just let me know once the script is ready. And then eventually the script was ready. I went back to him and he said, okay, well, this is kind of different than that teaser, but mm-hmm. It's great, and I believe in it, and I want to get it made. And he's he says always go where the energy is, and he had that energy, and he really loved it, and mm-hmm. as much as I did. And so he started sending it around and shopping around the script together with that teaser and my shorts, and eventually Maven Pictures in New York said they wanted to do it. And then it became a dialogue of, well, how much does it cost? Who's going to be in it, etc. But actually, from the time the script was written to the time we shot the first scene, it was probably a year.
Uh-huh. So yeah, in Hollywood standards, yeah, that's very quick. Let's just talk quickly about getting Liv Tyler involved with the project. I get a number of emails from screenwriters asking, hey, how can I get this actor attached to my script? And I'm always curious to hear how people did it. Maybe you can talk about a little bit about that process. Did you guys hire a casting director? Was there some contacts that you had, that maybe mutual contacts between you and Liv Tyler? How did you get the script to her, and how did you ultimately get her interested in starring in it?
Yeah. Well, I didn't know her personally before the film, so it was really the official route, and
the official route is getting a casting director submitting to her agent.
Yeah, or the production company going through the agent and the management. Yeah. So it was really like step number one, finding my manager Lee to find producers. Step number two, he found the production company, and I really loved especially their film Let the Right One In. A huge fan, and I was so thrilled when they said, "We want to take a stab at this," and then they got behind it. So now I had a script, a teaser, and a production company. So the next thing was lead role. Like, okay, Liv is a very important part of the movie, but the most important part is Anna, because she's in every single scene, carries the whole film as a character. It's her movie, so we had to find Anna first, and my producers recommended Belle because they had just seen her in Diary of a Teenage Girl, so they arranged a meeting between the two of us. I met Belle and was blown away. She really wanted to do it, and I realized, okay, now we can make the movie. Now we have this wonderful young actress as our lead, and then from there on, the project just then automatically starts to gain a little momentum, because suddenly you have a lead actress attached, and then okay, now you're talking with investors, and okay, the script goes out to cast the other roles, and then both Liv and also Brad simply responded to the script. I'm sure they also wanted to work with Belle. That might have been even a factor in all of this, since she was already attached. But I think they thought this has some good character material to work with, and that's how they came on board.
Yeah, perfect. So what's the best way for people to keep up with what you're doing? Twitter, Facebook, a blog, anything you're comfortable sharing, I'll round up and put in the show notes.
Yeah, I know I should be more present in those areas. I don't do that much social media. I mean, I have a Facebook account. That's about it.
Okay. No problem at all.
I think we're just going to use Google, and then IFC Midnight, who are releasing the film, they have a Twitter feed where they're posting news about the movie, and we're starting to get into the online blogs that have a place for indie movies and for genre movies. So there's tons of ways actually on the web. Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. As I said, I'll round up the IFP Midnight site and their Twitter feed and put those in the show notes. Fritz, I really appreciate your coming on the show and talking with me today. Good luck with this film.
Thank you. My pleasure. Have a great day.
You too. We'll talk to you later. Bye. I just want to talk quickly about SYS Select. It's a service for screenwriters to help them sell their screenplays and get writing assignments. The first part of the service is the SYS Select Screenplay Database. Screenwriters upload their screenplays along with a logline, synopsis, and other pertinent information like budget and genre, and then producers search for and hopefully find screenplays that they want to produce. Dozens of producers are in the system looking for screenplays right now. I launched this service at the beginning of this year, and we've already started to see some success stories. You can check out SYS podcast episode 222 with Steve Deering. He was the first official success story to come out of the SYS Select database. You can learn more about all of this by going to sellingyourscreenplayselect.com. When you join SYS Select, you get access to the screenplay database that I just mentioned, along with all the other services that we're providing to SYS Select members. Those services include the monthly newsletter that goes out to our list of 400 producers who are actively seeking writers and screenplays. Each SYS Select member can pitch one screenplay in this monthly newsletter. We also have partnered with one of the premier paid screenwriting leads sites, so I can syndicate their leads to SYS Select members. There are lots of great paid leads coming in each week from our partner. Recently, we've been getting 5 to 10 high-quality paid leads per week. These leads run the gamut. There's producers looking for a specific type of spec script to producers looking to hire a screenwriter to write up one of their ideas or properties. They're looking for shorts, they're looking for features, TV and web series pilots, all types of different projects. If you sign up for SYS Select, you'll get these leads emailed directly to you several times per week. Also, you can get access to the SYS Select forum where we will help you with your logline and query letter and answer any screenwriting related questions that you might have. Also in the forum are all the recorded screenwriting classes that I've done over the years, so you'll have access to all of those as well. The classes cover every part of the writing process, from concept to outlining to the first act, second act, third act, as well as other topics like writing short films and pitching your projects in person. Once again, if this sounds like something you would like to learn more about, please go to sellingyourscreenplayselect.com. Again, that's sellingyourscreenplayselect.com. On the next episode of the podcast, I'm going to be interviewing writer-director Dylan Reynolds. He just did a horror film called 420 Massacre. We talk about that film and how it all came together for him, so keep an eye out for that episode next week. To wrap things up, I just want to touch on a few things from today's interview with Fritz. So lots of great information in that interview. I love what Fritz had to say about being a part of the process, whether that was being a driver or just a production assistant or other low-level job on set. Just getting involved with the process and seeing how it all works is so, so important. And I think exactly what he did is precisely the best thing that any of us could do if you're starting out. Filmmaking is such a complex process, and it's the only way you're going to learn about it is by actually being on set and being a part of of that process. So if you're in a position like Fritz was, which basically means you're young without a lot of other commitments, I highly recommend this approach. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Working in the industry really does give you the best chance at making it as a screenwriter. So if you're in a position to do this, it's really the best thing you can do. And this is why I'm such a big proponent of making your own film, even if that means just making a simple short film. You will go through the whole filmmaking process from top to bottom, and you will learn an incredible amount about it by doing this. Again, there's really no way of learning this. You can read books, you can listen to podcasts, you can watch YouTube videos, you can learn about the process, but that's ultimately not going to teach you the process. What's going to really teach you about the process is actually doing it, being involved with it, making those decisions, being on set, all of that stuff. So I really think, again, what Fritz is recommending is in some ways what I've been recommending on the podcast. Getting out there, being involved, figuring out the process. That's going to make you a better writer. You're just going to understand how this all works better. Again, even if you go out and make a short film and it's terrible, you're still going to learn a lot from it. That's going to make you a better writer. It's going to make you understand production better. So I just couldn't recommend that more. So now let's talk about option agreements for a minute. Nothing to do with the interview with Fritz, but this is a common question that I get quite often from people emailing me. And the question goes something like this. There's a variety of different ins and outs with it, but the question basically goes something like this. I have a producer interested in optioning one of my screenplays. She has presented me with an option agreement, but I'm not sure I fully understand it. Do I need to get a lawyer for this? So first, congratulations. Getting an option on your screenplay is a good first step towards getting your screenplay produced. So congratulations on that. I remember when I had my first option, and it was very exciting, and it actually ended up working out. So these option agreements can go from option agreement to produce films. Doesn't always work out that way, but this is definitely, 9 times out of 10, getting that option agreement is the first step to getting that produced credit. So again, congratulations. That's definitely a step in the right direction. So the short answer is basically yes, get an attorney. This is a legal document. There are some complexities to this, and having someone who is an expert at these types of agreements is always a smart thing to do. The other little caveat is that I am not an attorney. My suggestions are not legal advice, and they should not be construed as such. My suggestions might not be right for you or your situation. So again, as with all things that will require you to sign a legal document, you should always seek the advice of a qualified attorney before signing such a document. So first, let's define what an option agreement is, just in case you don't understand what it is I'm talking about. When a producer finds a piece of material they like, and they think that maybe they want to try and produce this piece of material, they will present the writer with what's called an option agreement. The option agreement typically gives the producer the exclusive right to purchase the property for a set amount of time and at a set price. So the option agreement is not a purchase. They're not purchasing the script. All they are doing is basically buying the right to purchase the script. So basically, if the producer can raise the money to produce the film, they know they can purchase it from you, the writer, and they know the terms are already set in that specific option agreement. This protects the producer from going out and spending a lot of time trying to raise money for a project, only to come back to the writer and then have the writer say, no, I'm not going to sell you the script for whatever reason. So the producer knows when he's out trying to raise that money, he knows that if he does raise the money, he'll be able to exercise that option agreement, get the script at the set price, and everything will already be negotiated. He's not going to have basically the rug pulled out from under him. And that makes sense. Producers, their time is valuable too, and so they don't want to spend a lot of time trying to work on a project if it's not going to come through in the end, if the writer's going to give them problems. So how can you find an entertainment attorney is the next sort of logical question. My best advice for finding a lawyer would be to simply do a Google search for Los Angeles entertainment attorney, and you will get a few to choose from. If you're going to pay an attorney for this sort of advice, I would highly recommend that you get an attorney with a lot of experience in this area. So I wouldn't necessarily just hire a sort of a general attorney. And that's why I'm suggesting in your Google search, it's Los Angeles Entertainment Attorney, not necessarily your local town, because in your local town, there may not be anybody that deals with these types of option agreements on a regular basis. And again, if you're going to spend money, the hourly rate of these attorneys probably isn't going to be that much different. So you might as well hire an attorney that has experience with this specific topic, because that's what you're going to ultimately be paying for, and that's what you're going to ultimately want if you do go this route and hire an attorney. But before you hire an attorney, you want to read and then reread and probably reread a third time the option agreement. If you have any questions about the option agreement, I would go back and ask the producers about it. If you don't understand something, simply ask the producers. The more understanding of the agreement you have when you hire the lawyer, the cheaper it's going to be, because these lawyers typically charge by the hour. And if you have lots of very basic questions, that will eat up time and cost you money. And in most cases, the producers probably could have answered these types of questions for you for free. I mean, if they're sending you an agreement for you to sign, it stands to reason that they themselves understand the agreement. They've probably paid a lawyer to write this agreement, or at the very least, sign off on the agreement. So the producer probably understands what the agreement says, and they're probably perfectly happy to explain it to you. Just casually, you ask a question, hey, what does this mean? What is this for? And they will probably explain it to you. Now, obviously, they have a vested interest in, negotiating on their behalf. So you're not necessarily taking what they say as, exactly what they, you're not going to necessarily sign off on that. If they say it says thus and such, you're still going to be checking with a lawyer. But in most cases, I found there's no real reason for a producer to lie in this case, or to misrepresent what the option agreement says. So I found in my career that most of the time the lawyers are pretty upfront about this. So again, it's a good, cheap way to get advice from the producer who presented this agreement to you. And again, that's going to kind of give you more information about what this agreement actually says. So when you go to the lawyer and start to get them to review it, you will have a better understanding, and you will be able to get through that process quicker, which will mean that it is going to be cheaper for you, because again, the lawyers are typically charging by the hour. Okay, so here's a couple of suggestions that I would give you in terms of negotiating the option agreement. And that's my other suggestion. Again, the less the lawyer has to do, the cheaper it's going to be for you. So in my opinion, you should be the one that actually negotiates the very basic terms of this option agreement. Again, you can have the lawyer do that, and if he's experienced in this, he can do that. But I have found with these types of producers, where you're talking about typically, low budget films. These are non-WGA signatory producers, so they're not big budgeted projects. There's not a lot to negotiate. The terms of these things are pretty standard, and as long as you know sort of what the standard terms are, you can probably negotiate these items, as well as the lawyer, because again, on a low budget project, we're talking about less than $1 million as the total budget, less than even $2-3 million as the total budget. There's not a lot of wiggle room. We're not talking about these things are going to be vastly different from one agreement to another. So for the most part, if you understand the basic terms, you can probably do a lot of the negotiating. And I'm going to kind of explain what I consider to be some of the basic terms. So let's dig into that. Some of the basic items that should be in an option agreement are, first and foremost, how long this option agreement is for. 6 months is usually about the least you can negotiate, but less is better for the writer. On occasion, I've been able to get a producer to agree to a 30-day option, or in some cases a 90-day option. Usually the producer is going to push for longer, but I like to push for shorter, obviously. So try and get this as short as possible. I think 6 months is usually pretty fair, and I've been able to get most producers to agree to that, with the stipulation that they can extend the option. So that's the next point. Number 2 is, can the producer renew the option agreement? If it's going to expire and they're still working on the deal, they're feeling some momentum, can they go and just automatically extend that option agreement for another 6 months or another year? And if they can, how much does that cost them? This is a very important thing, because this is going to go hand in hand with that first thing, getting that original option agreement as short as possible. I'm usually pretty generous on this. I don't mind if a producer producer is going to extend an option agreement, that's fine, but I'll usually charge them a little bit of money. Even something like $500 is enough to make that producer think twice about doing the renewal or not. What I have found, usually a producer, what I've found is that a producer will option a screenplay. There's this sort of burst of new creative energy. They will take that screenplay out to their contacts, which is usually a fairly finite list of people that they're going to take this project to, and they'll know whether it's getting traction fairly quickly. So a 6-month option usually gives them plenty of time to do this. What I found is usually the producers find out well before 6 months. Usually it's like in a month or two, they know whether this thing is really getting traction or not. And so then if it's not getting traction and you've got this little stipulation in the contract that it's $500 for the next 6 months, if it's not getting traction, they're going to just let it go. They're not going to pay you even that $500. Now, if it is getting traction, $500 is not so much money that it's really going to be that big of a deal for the producer. So I have found is limiting the option agreements to about 6 months. Usually most producers will be okay with that as long as you give them this ability to extend the option agreement at, let's say, $500 for 6 months or even $500 for a year. Because the last thing you want to do is just sign a free 18-month option. What's going to happen is the producer is going to work hard on this script, maybe for 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 months, 6 months. But at that point, if it's not getting traction, they're going to just sort of put it on the back burner, and maybe they'll have some sort of loose ends out there. But for the most part, you know, there's a good chance they're just going to put it on the back burner. And what do they care? They've got this free option for 18 months, and so they'll just ride it out for the 18 months. But again, if you put in these little steps where they have to make a decision every 6 months, that's a good thing. It's a good thing for you, and it's also, frankly, a good thing for producer not to just waste your time. So that's the second part of it. Try and get some sort of at least small amount of money for those option extensions. If the option does get exercised, basically meaning if they decide to buy your screenplay, you are going to negotiate in this option agreement the final purchase price. So for independent films, for WGA signatory films, you can go to the WGA website and you can look up what the WGA minimums are. I'm not up on those at the moment, but they do change from time to time. And again, you can go to the WGA website and look at those if you're curious. Usually sort of a typical range, as someone who is not a WGA writer and has spent their career working with more independent producers on more independent films, I can tell you, you can usually get between 2 and 3% of the production budget. And when I say production budget, the producers will typically not count contingency fees, which basically means like insurance and stuff. Producers will typically get some sort of insurance, completion bonds, those types of things are very typically not included in the final production budget that you get paid on. I would say those contingency insurance costs, bonds, those kinds of things, I think it's probably 10 to 15% of the total budget. So just to make the math easy, you know, if it was $1 million movie, you would get, let's say, 2 or 3%, let's say 2%, but I would say about 10 to 15% of that would probably be these contingency costs, and you would not get paid on that. So you would get paid on, let's say, the $900,000 budget or the $850,000. You can work your math out yourself, 2 to 3% of that. You also want to make sure, though, part of the purchase price, you want to make sure that you get some sort of a floor as a minimum. So basically, you're going to state in there, okay, if you do exercise the option, you're going to pay me as either, let's say, 2.5% of the production budget, or let's say $10,000, whichever is greater. So that's going to be the floor. You're going to set that in there. And the way you're going to set the floor with the producer is you're going to simply ask them early in this process, what kind of budget are you thinking of raising? And the thing is, at this stage of the negotiation, the producer is optimistic and positive. And so whatever number he thinks he's going to produce this movie at, it's frankly probably a lot higher than what he's ultimately going to produce it at. So let's just say he says, oh, I'm going to raise $1 million to do this movie. So, okay, great. You know, 2.5% of $1 million is $25,000. So could we make that the floor for this project? And most likely they're going to agree with that. Now, they might want to push it down a little bit. That's fine. But you want to understand where you're at with the floor, because you don't want him to necessarily call you up in, 5.5 months and say, okay, we're going to make your movie on a $10,000 budget. Where should I send your check for $300? Because 3% of $10,000 is only $300. You want to avoid those kinds of, confusion. I mean, and I'm not necessarily against someone going and making a $10,000 feature film. That's totally fine. And if you are on board with that, that's great. But you want to know that, you know, early in the process, you don't want the producer to surprise you with that. If he's telling you, I'm going to make this movie for $1 million, that's one thing. Which is entirely different than making this movie for $10,000. So again, setting that floor it'll kind of just set some minimums, and it will just kind of get everything above board and sort of what the expectations for this film are. You can always renegotiate the contract. He can come back to you, you know, in 6 months, say, listen, I can only raise $50,000. Can we go and make this movie for $50,000? And then you can renegotiate, because obviously he couldn't pay you $25,000 on a $50,000 budget for the screenplay. That would not make any sense. So again, it just gives you some outs if he wants to make the movie for much cheaper. I have never found producers have a big problem with this, because again, they have some number in their mind as in terms of a budget of what they want to raise. Now, the other flip side of this is that the producer might want to insist on putting a ceiling, which basically means capping your fee as well. So if he raises, you know, $20 million, you're not going to necessarily get 3% of the $20 million. And that's fine too. I would say most of the time the caps are sort of more in line with sort of WGA rates. So for a feature film, you might get capped at $200,000 or $150,000 or $100,000. Something I would say in the six figures is kind of typical for a feature film. But again, it depends on what the budget and it depends on what the producer thinks he's going to raise in terms of a budget. I have never had a project. I've had dozens of options. I've had a few of those options turn into, you know, where they got exercised and the scripts actually got purchased. I have never one single time run into an issue where we hit the ceiling. It's always the opposite. You know, a lot of times we're hitting the floor, because again, when producers start on a project, they're always overly optimistic, and they always think that they're going to raise a lot more money than they ultimately raise. So I never spend a lot. I don't think negotiating hard on the ceiling, as long as it's some reasonable number, I wouldn't spend a lot of time on this, because again, in most instances, the producer's not going to hit the ceiling. They're going to be probably hitting the floor, not the ceiling. So that's the next thing. That was number 3 on my items as far as making sure that there's something in the option agreement for the purchase price. The fourth thing that I think definitely needs to be in there is what sort of screen credit you will get on the film. This is very, very important. You want it clearly stated in the contract that you will receive screenwriting credit, even if other writers are brought on and also get credit. So you might end up sharing the credit. That's very standard in the industry. If a producer is going to bring on another writer, you might get shared credit. But you want to make sure that no matter what happens, you will still get screenplay by, or you will get written by credit. You're not fighting for story by, and you're not necessarily concerned with based on material by credits. Those are sort of, you know, lukewarm writing credits, and not something that you even really care about. But it's the screenplay by and it's the written by credits that you want to make sure are clearly outlined in this option agreement. Now, typically what producers do is they have some boilerplate language that to sort of cover this, and it typically is something to the effect of credit will be awarded according to WGA industry standards. Now, unless you're in the WGA, you do not want this in the language. If this ends up being a non-signatory project, which if you're not in the WGA, most likely it will be a non-WGA signatory project, the WGA isn't going to be willing to figure out the credits for you and the other writers if you're not in the WGA and it's not a WGA signatory project. So the WGA, they do this for their members. That's a service they offer to WGA members, but not non-WGA members, obviously. So it doesn't make any sense to even have that language in there when it's not a WGA signatory project, because the WGA is not going to have any jurisdiction or, frankly, any interest in this project. So you don't want that language in there, even though it's typically the boilerplate language that they use. Now, if the producers do end up hiring some WGA writers to rewrite some portion of the project, then it might become a WGA signatory project. And if that happens and you're not in the WGA, then you're not going to get much of a credit. So again, you'd want to avoid this. Now, you can't necessarily avoid them hiring WGA writers. That's up to them. But again, you want to make sure that it's clear in your contract that you will get screenplay by or written by credit, even if it's shared with other writers. And you don't want to leave this to the WGA process, because you're not in the if you're not in the WGA, they are not going to give you, the WGA is not going to award you any credit if it gets to that. I think if you're not in the WGA and a producer hires WGA writers, I think the WGA writers would get credit, and I think you would just get like a story by, or maybe a based on previously written material by. You would not get that screenplay by credit. So again, this is very important that you work with the producer on this. And this is one point that almost assuredly the producer is going to come at you with this boilerplate WGA language. It's usually pretty easy. I mean, the producers are usually just putting it in there because it's easy and it makes most writers happy. But again, if you're not in the WGA, I would strongly urge you to remove this paragraph and put in something super clear, which says, you know, basically to the effect of, under any circumstances, I will receive screenplay by or written by credit, even if it's shared with other writers. You just want something that clear, and it doesn't have anything to do with anything else that happens. I mean, with these low budget films, independent films, I mean, the studio level projects are different. I mean, there's a lot of residuals at stake. There's going to be a lot of writers involved on these sort of independent films that I've spent my career on. I mean, most of the time they'll bring on another writer, or the director will do some rewriting, but it's not like these independent producers have huge budgets and they're going to run through 10 writers. They're not going to they're not going to option your script unless they basically like it. Maybe they like 60% or 80% or, you know, 50% of it. They might rewrite some of it, but they're not going to get involved with a project that they're just going to rewrite, you know, a page one rewrite. It just wouldn't make sense for an independent producer to do that. I'm not saying it's never happened, but I would say that's a highly unlikely scenario. And the reason I'm pointing that out is because the WGA rules are that you have to write a third of the script, like your material. There has to be a third of the produced movie has to be your written material for you to get writing credit. And I don't quote me on that. I think that's roughly what their sort of criteria is. And so the argument from the producer might be, well, if we don't use at least a third of your material, why should you get writing credit? And the response to that is, a producer, if you're negotiating this, is that you shouldn't option and buy my script if you're going to use less than a third of the material. You don't want to sell your script or option your script to a producer that's going to use less than a third of your material. So again, in all cases, when I sign option agreements at this stage of my career, it specifically lays out what that credit will be, and it is not, I'm not leaving it up to the WGA. And I recommend that you probably do the same thing. Okay, so the next and final point is the rewrites. Inevitably, the producer, the director, maybe some of the actors, they will have some ideas on how to rewrite this project. There might be small little rewrites, they might be big little rewrites, but you need something in this option agreement that clearly states that any and all ideas and rewritten material is the sole property of you. And so if this option is not exercised, you can still take those ideas and you can incorporate those into your screenplay, and you can take that screenplay to another producer unencumbered by this producer and his company, and those ideas do not belong to him and his company. They belong to you as the writer. And even if they pay you to do some of these rewrites, you still want that clause in your contract, because again, it makes, if this producer does not exercise the option, they don't buy the script, it's going to make taking that script to another producer very, very messy. If they had a bunch of ideas, they gave you ideas, or maybe they even rewrote some of the pages on their own and sent them to you, you know, you've been exposed to those ideas. You need to know that if they don't option the script, if they don't exercise the option to the script, if they don't produce your movie, you own those rewrites and you can take it to another producer, and there's no murky business about who owns what ideas. Okay, so again, I just want to reiterate this. Please, please, please understand that this is not me giving out any sort of legal advice. This is just my thoughts on the topic. I'm just kind of trying to lay out sort of what I've done, and hopefully that can help you. But again, I'm not a lawyer, and as with all things legal, please always consult with a qualified attorney before signing any legal document. Okay, so what I've just discussed sort of lays out the basic steps to negotiating an option agreement. But the real problem, if you haven't already figured that out, is that in attorney charges, let's just say $300 per hour, and sometimes a lot more, and it's probably going to take, even if you negotiate the contract yourself and you read it and reread it and ask a lot of questions of the producer, it's still probably going to take 3 to 4 hours of the lawyer's time to read through this, make notes, have a consultation with you to explain these notes. So, just to make the math easy, you're talking $1,000, maybe $1,500 to do 3 or 4 hours worth of work on this thing. That's not an insignificant amount of money, especially considering the fact in a lot of cases you're giving free options or very inexpensive options. I often still, to this day, at this stage of my career, I often sign free option agreements, or at the very most, maybe I get $500. Maybe you can squeeze out $1,000 with these independent producers, but those are sort of the exception. I would say the vast majority of these producers are going to be looking for $10, maybe $100 options. So the legal costs will easily be more than what you actually make from the option agreement. So that's the next question. How do you make all of this work? So one suggestion that you might be able to pull off is you might be able to find an attorney who will only charge you a percentage of what you earn. Typically, this is 5%. But it's not always easy to find an attorney. If you don't have any produced credits, I think most attorneys are probably not going to be willing to do this because they're going to realize that this is just one option agreement. You may not sell this and you may never have another one. So if you don't have any credits, I think it's going to be hard to find this type of attorney, but you might be able to. Now, keep in mind, too, what I'm saying here. Let's just say, to make the math easy, that you get an option, you sign a 1-year option agreement, and the producer gives you $1,000 for that option agreement. So then you would send your lawyer $50, basically 5% of that $1,000 for that thing. Now, but what the lawyer is really gambling on is that this producer will exercise that option, and then you'll get, let's say it's $1 million movie, so you'll get your $25,000, and then the lawyer would get 5% of that $25,000. So the lawyer is kind of gambling a little bit as well. Now, again, if you have a bunch of produced credits, if you're have a bunch of option agreements that you've worked on over the years, I think you might be able to find a lawyer who would basically work for the 5% as opposed to an hourly rate. But you may not be able to find that. So, I was not. When I was starting out in my career, I was never able to find this lawyer who would work for a percentage, not necessarily an hourly rate. So I throw that as a suggestion, but don't get too caught up on that because it's probably going to be very hard to find that. But that is a possibility. Okay, so most likely you won't be able to find a lawyer like that. So then what's the next stage of this? And unfortunately, there's no easy answer here. It's a matter of using your judgment and trying to make the best decisions in a fairly difficult situation. Doing all these things that I've talked about, understanding the contract, talking to the producer about it, trying to negotiate the terms, trying to research it. I'm going to tell you what I did early on in my career, and I want to be clear. This is not what I'm recommending. It's just sort of the reality of the situation, and this is what I did. But it's, again, not what I necessarily recommended or what I necessarily would recommend that you do. When I first started out, I didn't have a lot of money. I was, fresh out of college, rolled into LA, had a cheap apartment, a fairly low-paying job, and I started to get presented with these option agreements. And again, these option agreements, they were not paying me enough money to hire an attorney. So I did a lot of what I'm recommending here. I read the agreements myself, tried to learn about option agreements. You can do some Google research, find out about option agreements, ask other screenwriters, go on forums. You can do a lot of due diligence in getting up to speed on these things. In most cases, this strategy basically worked out. So I would read the agreements, try and understand them, ask the producers, ask some of my writer friends. I would negotiate as best I could. And I would say most of the time these worked out fine. But I did get into some legal trouble on a few situations, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. I can think of 2 projects where I signed option agreements without really understanding them. And again, these did sort of result in some legal issues, although I was able to resolve them without going to court or having to hire a lawyer. So it wasn't too terrible, but it was a hassle. So that's kind of the warning. if you don't hire a lawyer, you are setting yourself up for some potential legal issues. Now, again, I was able to work them out without spending any money on lawyers or court or anything like that, but it's just worth considering. So let me just talk about the specifics of the situations, these two legal situations that I did run into, and maybe I think they'll shed some light on sort of the kinds of problems. I mean, you probably won't run into these specific problems, but you may sort of run into some sort of similar problems, and maybe this will just give you some information, something to think about. So the first situation, I was a young guy. As I said, I'd been in Hollywood maybe 3 years, and I optioned my script. It wasn't the first script I optioned. It was maybe third or fourth, fifth script I optioned. I had done a couple of options before, but I was still pretty green to the process. It was a production company that was, they had done a lot of commercials and special effects, and so they were getting into features. And so they found my script, and they optioned it, and then we started to develop it. And we spent a lot of time developing it. I was working with, it was a producer who owned the company, and then he was friends and had hired this director. And so me and the director every day for probably a month, we sat in a room and just went over the script and just developed it. And so I sort of started to become friends with this director, and the option did not end up getting exercised. They were not able to raise the money, and the director and this producer, they eventually parted ways as well. And as I said, I had sort of become friends with this director, and he told me once the option the option expired, he then sort of pulled me aside and said, hey, we had a bad experience with a previous writer where we had done a bunch of development and she had just taken off with the project. And so in your contract, we made it kind of clear that we were paying you for the rewrites. And they had paid me a decent amount of money for the option. But the way they had worded in the contract was that it was for the option and the rewrites. And what that meant was that they then owned the rewrites. So I now had this script which had been developed considerably through this process, but I didn't own the rewrites. I owned the original script. The problem with that was that if I took the original script to another producer, it's quite probable that this new producer would have a lot of the same ideas as that original producer. And then it's like, well, who owns those ideas? If he comes up with something independent, it just gets into this murky gray area where, the original producer could say, well, I paid good money to develop those ideas. I want some portion of this script as well. So again, as you can see, it makes things murky. And that's why I mentioned when I was laying out sort of some of the things that should be in the option agreement, this is a prime reason why you want to make sure there's a clause in the option agreement that clearly specifies who owns any new ideas, any of these rewritten pages. And it should be the writer because you've got the original material and it makes the most sense. Now, what I did was, again, I'd sort of become friends with these guys, so it wasn't a big issue. And I just went to the producer and basically said, hey, man, I want to, your option has expired. You're not going to pursue the project. Do you mind if I take it to other producers? And he said no. And I just wrote up a little document that basically said, I own all the rewrites on this. And he was happy to sign it and let me on my way. So again, didn't work out particularly poorly, but I could see that the director and the producer, they were sharks and they saw that I was kind of a babe in the woods at the time. And they purposely did write this contract so that if I did end up giving them problems, then they would at least be protected. So again, you just want to be aware of these things, how the rewrites are going to shake out and plan accordingly. So the second situation, and I sort of alluded to this earlier, this will all sound very familiar. I had a producer call me up one day and say, okay, basically, so take a step back. I had a film noir screenplay. He optioned it, and he was pursuing it. And this went on for I think, years. They would renew the option, and I honestly don't even remember if I charged them anything for the option. This was years and years ago. But it was him and his buddy, these two producers, and they kept trying to bring on a more experienced producer. They kept trying to bring on directors. So we were going through this process where, I would meet a new director and we would develop the script a little bit. I would meet another producer that they introduced me to, that they wanted to bring in, and that producer would be more experienced. Generally, that producer had a lot more experience raising the money. So that was kind of their piece. So this went on for, at least let's say a year. I think it probably went on longer. Eventually the option was coming to an end, and this producer called me up and said, great news. I've raised the money. We're going to produce your movie. I said, fantastic. What's the budget? He said, the total budget for the film is $10,000. So your 3% is $300. Where do you want me to send the $300? And what I ended up sort of figuring out was, obviously originally we were talking about, you know, a $1 million, $2 million movie. So this was a very much an about face. And again, this is precisely why I mentioned earlier, you want to get some sort of a floor in the contract so that this precise situation cannot happen. Now, in this particular case, what I realized fairly quickly was that this producer was worried that once the option lapsed, I would then take the project to this other producer who he had introduced me to and try and get the project going with that producer, because the producer he had introduced me to was much more experienced than he was and liked the project. And I think maybe he had even called me. It was more involved. Like it was not just this producer being paranoid. It was actually probable. And in fact, but basically what I did was I went to the producer and I said, and I kind of just leveled with him and said, listen, are you just, you know, you're worried I'm going to go to this other producer and cut you out of the deal. What if we sign some sort of agreement that I will never do that? And once we did that, he immediately, of course, didn't want to go and make this $10,000 feature film. But I think in his mind, he could buy the script for $10,000, produce, you know, basically a nonsensical version with his video camera of the film, and then he would basically own the script. He would probably never have even bothered to make any kind of a polished film. I don't know what his real plan was, but bottom line was I did sign something with him. As I said, I was not looking to like cut him out of the deal or anything. He was a perfectly nice guy. He did in fact introduce me to this producer. So we just signed something that says, hey, if I ever work with this other producer over here that you introduced me to, I will be sure and make sure that you're cut in on that deal. And the other producer was fine with that. Eventually I did, I think I did option the script to this other producer, and we just had some sort of a clause so that this original producer would get some credit and some money if the project ever got off the ground. So again, problem averted, no lawyers, no court, but I could see that it was definitely a potential problem. And hopefully in the future, you know, I've been able to head this off by getting some sort of a floor in the contract. Okay, so that's option agreements. Again, I'm not a lawyer. This is not legal advice. It's just kind of how I've dealt with it. Hopefully you get some value out of hearing how I've dealt with it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a question on my frequently asked questions section at Selling Your Screenplay. So if you just go to sellingyourscreenplay.com/FAQ, I will link to this podcast, and I will link to it in such a way that you can just skip straight to this section where I'm talking about option agreements. And there's been a number of other podcast episodes where I've talked about option agreements, and so I will also link to those from this FAQ page. So again, just go to sellingyourscreenplay.com/FAQ if you want to hear more, just more ramblings of me talking about option agreements. There's been a bunch of other podcast episodes. One of the ones was discussing free options. Should you do free options? So I'll try and find that link to that as well. But there's some other ones where I've just kind of gone through, I've talked about an actual option agreement that I'm negotiating, and I sort of walk through those steps. And that could kind of, hopefully you'll see, this will be a good primer for that. You'll kind of see the logic that I use. And then this other podcast episode, I sort of walk through the various steps that I just outlined in an actual real world situation. So again, I will link to all that, sellingyourscreenplay.com/FAQ. Anyway, that's the show. Thank you for listening.